She saw the future so clearly it destroyed her. Not because she was wrong, because she was 100 years too early. Ada Lovelace was born in 1815, the only legitimate child of Lord Byron, the most famous poet in England, a man of such volcanic temperament and scandalous reputation that his wife left him when Ada was 5 weeks old and spent the rest of her life making sure her daughter would never become him. Ada's mother, Annabella, was a mathematician. She raised Ada on logic, geometry, and the rigid discipline of numbers, a deliberate antidote, she believed, to the dangerous romanticism of the father Ada would never know. It didn't work the way Annabella intended. Ada got both. She got the precision of her mother and the imagination of her father, and the combination produced something that the 19th century had no category for and no real ability to absorb: a woman who thought numbers, words, music, or the mechanical movement of gears. She was 17 when she met Charles Babbage. Babbage was a mathematician and inventor who had spent years designing a machine he called the difference engine, a mechanical calculator of extraordinary complexity intended to automate the production of mathematical tables. He had not built it yet. The engineering of Victorian England was not quite equal to the precision his designs required, but he was already thinking beyond it, toward a new machine he called the Analytical Engine, a general-purpose mechanical computer driven by punch cards, capable of being programmed to perform any calculation in any sequence. Everyone who saw the plans for the Analytical Engine saw an impressive calculator. Ada Lovelace saw something else entirely. She saw a machine that could manipulate symbols, not just numbers, but any system of symbols that could be given a formal rule. She saw that if music could be represented as relationships between notes, the machine could compose music. If graphics could be described as mathematical relationships, the machine could generate images. She saw, with a clarity that would not be matched for a century, that the Analytical Engine was not a calculator. It was a universal machine. It could, in principle, do anything that could be formally described. She wrote this down. In 1843, she translated an article about the Analytical Engine written by an Italian mathematician and added her own notes that were 3 times longer than the original article and contained, among other things, the first algorithm ever written for a computing machine, a step-by-step set of instructions for calculating a sequence of numbers written for a machine that had not been built, in a discipline that did not yet have a name, by a woman in a society that did not believe women were capable of serious mathematical thought. She called herself an analyst and a metaphysician. She said she believed herself to possess a peculiar combination of qualities, a union of intellect and imagination that allowed her to see connections that others missed. She was right. She was also 27 years old, writing in a world where women were not admitted to universities, could not vote, and were generally understood to be intellectually suited for domestic life and the gentler arts. The notes were published under her initials, A.A.L, because a woman's name on a scientific paper would have undermined its credibility in the eyes of the men who read such things. The machine she wrote for was never built. Babbage ran out of money, lost government funding, and spent the rest of his life arguing with engineers and bureaucrats. The Analytical Engine existed only in drawings and in Ada's notes. Her health had been fragile since childhood, a history of illness that modern scholars have variously attributed to several conditions, none of them fully verified by the incomplete medical records of the era. She was in pain for much of her adult life, and the treatments available to a Victorian woman in pain included laudanum and other opiates, which created their own spiral of dependency and deterioration. She gambled, heavily and badly, accumulating debts that her husband had to manage and that consumed energy and attention that might have gone to work. She died on November 27, 1852. She was 36 years old, the same age as she apparently noted herself in the final months of her life that her father Byron had died. She had asked to be buried beside him, the father she had never known, the poet whose romanticism she had inherited, and whose early death she mirrored. Her notes on the analytical engine were not rediscovered in any meaningful way until the 1950s, when the first actual computers were being built, and the people building them were trying to understand what it was they were building. Alan Turing, working on the theoretical foundations of computation in the 1930s and 1940s, arrived at conclusions that Ada had reached a century earlier, working with a pen in a Victorian drawing room for a machine made of brass and steam. The United States Department of Defense named a programming language after her in the 1980s. It is called Ada. She had seen the machine before the machine existed. She had named its possibilities before anyone else understood it had any. She had written the first program for a computer in an era when the word computer referred to a person who performed calculations by hand. She was a ghost from the future, not haunting the past, but trapped in it, carrying knowledge that the world around her could not use, writing instructions for a machine that would not exist for 100 years, in a language that no one yet had a name for. The century caught up to her eventually. It always does. She just didn't live to see it.